No one likes being told that they can't do something. Rules and societal conventions are in place because that's just how the world works. But in the grand scheme of things, video games are pretty unimportant and inoffensive most of the time. But that just sounds like something we can censor the shit out of. Oh, I tell ya, I go from making a ton of Smash Bros videos and then videos talking about games from last year and this year, and then, hey, why don't I tackle the sensitive subject of video game censorship when I get back from doing all that? For a game to be banned from either one country or most of them, you can usually find some similar characteristics among those games that help explain why this decision was made. What do you mean a game called Rape Play, where you forcibly have sex with non-consenting women, with one of them being underage, was banned in just about every country on the planet? What a twist! So rather than focus on predictable stories of violent video games getting banned because they're violent, I'd like to focus on the weirder, more unusual side of the spectrum, where games get banned because I'm not really sure why. I personally love hearing the stories behind why this inoffensive, completely harmless video game is apparently the worst thing ever, and certain people in certain countries shouldn't play it under any circumstances. It's always good to know that I've played some games that are technically illegal in certain parts of the world. It's like a super low intensity way of living on the edge. Do you remember when Mass Effect had a reputation to uphold? Yeah, before the release of Mass Effect 3, this was a franchise on the rise, with BioWare leading from the front in the player choice-led action RPG market with plenty of steamy relations with strange-looking aliens. They've lost their way a bit since then, but we'll always have those first couple of games that exist as a near-perfect storm of RPG mechanics and pretty great writing, to be honest. Not that Mass Effect is a stranger to controversy though, as anyone who played through to the end of Mass Effect 3 will glumly attest to, but in 2007 this franchise was making the news for a very different reason. Like I said, you could fuck aliens, which is neat. Most of the drama surrounding the sex scenes in Mass Effect was very overblown at the time. It's like video games are trying these new things, and then there's people like, no, don't put porn in front of my child, when in fact it's very tame and leaves most of it up to the imagination. So why even mention it in this video? Because not everybody interprets the same things in the same way. At which point, into the ring strides Singapore, a country that very rarely, if ever, bans a video game and is generally pretty cool with most levels of violence and explicit content. Wikipedia implies they've only ever banned 3 video games. The Darkness, for some excessive violence that was later overturned. The first Half-Life, for apparently the same reason, although how, considering this is all pretty tame? The ban was lifted later, so that's okay. And the first Mass Effect for those raunchy sex scenes, although not for the obvious reason. Singapore were okay with the nature of most of these scenes, but took exception to anything involving 2 women. That's right, the issue wasn't the sex scenes themselves, but actually the display of homoerotic relations that Singapore has problems with. The official quote from the censors said that they didn't like how 2 women could have sex in the game, which is what is often cited as the main reason, but clearly they didn't get far enough to see that 2 guys could be doing the same. The ban didn't last too long though, and instead Mass Effect was slapped with the country's highest rating for a game, M18, and Singapore went back to being kinda cool about video games. Except homosexuality is still illegal in that country, but that's definitely not my area of expertise. I can over-explain video games for you if that helps. What I don't want to do with this video is challenge too many cultural norms. You know, Western culture is what it is, and we think ourselves to be pretty relaxed on the whole artistic expression thing, but that's not really the case elsewhere in the world. I don't want to be the guy who says that video games are a form of artistic expression, but some countries take to risque art in a less than flattering way. You know what comes to mind when I think risque art? That's right, Pokemon! Don't tell me that you don't see it too, that Pokemon has often been the headline act in the controversy variety show. Something about a game that encourages you to capture animals so you can mold them into efficient killers somehow rubs people up the wrong way. I just don't see it myself. Pokemon has taken fire in the past from religious groups for various reasons, mostly pertaining to the theme of evolution that has never really sat well with creationism, but come on guys. This is a dumb franchise with cutesy creatures where the main focus is making more wacky designed cutesy creatures, and they don't really care about any plot to overthrow world religion. I shouldn't have to say this, but how much time do you think the Pokemon Company have on their hands? So Christianity is safe for another day, but what about Islam? Generally a hardy religion that doesn't care too much what people think of it, but Saudi Arabia were very early adopters of the whole Pokemon is dangerous to our way of life thing. In 2001, they banned all types of Pokemon media, primarily for its ability to promote gambling, the usual concerns about evolution, and also this six-pointed star, also known as a hexagram. Supposedly this has turned up a lot in Pokemon, but the main example can be found in the trading cards. Saudi Arabia, a country that isn't such a big fan of Zionism or the Star of David, or really any religion that isn't Islam, put a big ban on the trading card game for including symbolism that doesn't match up with their view of the world. Banning a trading card video game is quite the stretch when you think about it, but clearly this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision because they renewed this ban when Pokemon Go came out and was being all popular in 2016. What did Pikachu ever do to you? He's such a good boy. International politics are complicated. The relationship that two countries share is subject to a lot of change based on how they react to certain events within the political climate, and how they balance caring for their own people as well as their perception to the outside world. Meanwhile, video games are cool. I always struggle a bit when it comes to how video games reflect real-world events because I primarily use them as a means of escaping reality. I'd rather not have to worry about the uneasy ground that Football Manager 2005 stepped on when they included Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan as separate countries within a game that was meant to be sold to China. Even I know that's not such a great idea. Long story short, because I don't have anywhere near the knowledge or understanding to go into any kind of detail, China doesn't like the idea of any of these regions being considered their own country, and the official stance from the Chinese government is that Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan are all either owned by China or places that China would probably like to own. So, when the 2005 edition of Football Manager recognized these territories as their own entities, China kicked up an almighty fuss and banned the game from being sold within the country. Sports Interactive, the guys behind Football Manager, said that they would release a Chinese-friendly version of the game with the offending countries merged in with China, but they also went on to explain that the standard version of Football Manager was never formally translated into Chinese because they had planned two separate versions from the start. Which is considerate, I suppose, but I'm just amazed that a sports simulation game caused so much uproar on a global scale, touching some clearly very sensitive nerves in China. If it's okay with you, I'm gonna stick with video games and... What's that in the water? Is it... No, it couldn't be! It's the long-lost plaque of Subscribble, where legends say that if you're enjoying this video and would like to see more, make sure to click subscribe and hit that bell to receive notifications of every new upload. I don't always talk politics, I promise. If you had to pick a country that you could live in that is practically devoid of any notable video game censorship, the absolute worst choice would be Australia, where despite having a stereotype of being a pretty relaxed, chilled out group of people, they have a very, very angry ratings board for games. Basically everything's bad, and you should feel bad. As a general rule of thumb, if a game can be banned with any slight semblance of reason, Australia will be the first to do so. I'm not sure why, and what I've heard from Australian citizens is that most people in Australia don't really get it either. A brief bit of research brought back a problem with Australia's classification laws being fairly rigid for decades, and a lack of any rating above MA15+ results in most games rated at 18 or M in Europe and the US being banned outright in Australia. Which makes sense, I suppose, at least they're consistently stringent with their attitude towards mature video games. But then I'm kinda struggling with their treatment of cult classic video game Mark Echo's Getting Up Contents Under Pressure, a game that was released with an M rating and was predictably banned from Australia, but not for those reasons. I haven't played this game, so I couldn't tell you with any great confidence why it has such a lofty rating, but it seems to be tackling themes of social unrest and using graffiti as a means of an uprising against a tyrannical government. Australia is doing alright for government at the moment, as they were 13 years ago when Getting Up first came out, but the powers that be still felt the need to ban it because they were worried about people being inspired to pick up some spray paint and decorate parts of Australia in graffiti. For as strange a concern as this is, the weirdest thing about it is that the Australian Ratings Board had no issue whatsoever with Jet Set Radio, which is another game where you rise up against authority and spray graffiti everywhere. Also, go look up the Blob, it's basically the same game, you're rising up against government, there's graffiti, you're a blob paint creature, it's the same game. Hell, there's a blossoming Splatoon scene over in Australia, and you'll never guess what all these woomies are spreading onto the ground. It's paint. Well, it's coloured ink, but it still has a graffiti-like quality to it that I'm sure could overthrow the Australian government in a flash if it needed to. Australia technically never lifted this ban, but Getting Up was released worldwide on Steam in 2013, and the Australian people were finally allowed to play this video game. Penny Arcade once described it as God's punishment for an evil world, so clearly it was worth the wait. Maybe Australia were onto something there. There has never and will ever be a more controversial collection of video games than Grand Theft Auto. They are magnets for eye-catching headlines about how playing these games will poison your children with violent tendencies and encourage them to venture down a slippery path of joyriding and prostitutes. We've all seen news reports about how dangerous the latest GTA game is, but the crazy thing is that they've been the subject of controversy since the very start. The first ever Grand Theft Auto game, complete with a top-down perspective, was heavily criticized for promoting this level of criminal activity to the impressionable young minds of the world. So Grand Theft Auto has always been controversial and has always been banned from various countries who are afraid of what it might do to those who play it. But then Brazil looked at some of the DLC to GTA 4 and thought, hey, this is all fine and everything, but if you're going to use unlicensed music, then don't fuck with me. Brazil has a fairly standard approach to video game censorship, generally allowing most games, but putting their foot down hard on stuff they don't like. Counter-Strike and EverQuest were banned for a little while for a variety of reasons to do with encouraging the subversion of social order, which definitely doesn't sound a little paranoid, but that's not as wacky as what they did with GTA 4 episodes from Liberty City, because the unlicensed inclusion of a sample of some Brazilian house music meant that Rockstar suddenly had an injunction to work around. Sales of this expansion in Brazil came with the equivalent of a $3,000 fine for every day a store continued to sell the game. So basically a ban then. What amazes me is that Brazil were perfectly content with the high levels of violence on display in other Grand Theft Auto games, but some legal issues involving music rights is what caused the Brazilian government to put their hat into the ring. They didn't leave it with the artist whose music was being used without the proper permission to chase it up, mainly because he was 8 years old at the time. Wonder what he's doing now. Brazil went in full force and banned the shit out of GTA 4 episodes from Liberty City. I'm not sure where we are with all this now, since Rockstar, Brazil, and the world in general has all moved on, but of all the things to ban GTA 4, I don't think anyone expected this. Rockstar don't even need to advertise their games anymore, entire countries will do it for them. This is RabbidLuigi, and I never want to be in a position where I'm telling foreign governments how to run their country, mainly because that's kind of crazy, but also, I feel like taking a small issue, something as minute as some illegal music in a video game, and making this huge fuss about it, probably wasn't the best thing for Brazil to do. But, you know, I understand, I get it. You need to protect rights. But maybe do it kind of quietly, rather than making this huge publicity stunt for Rockstar, basically. I mean, maybe they've mellowed over time, Brazil, because I've been using that music from the start of this segment, and I haven't been banned. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below, because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.